The Romans, when they came on the scene in the East, and they gradually became more and more powerful, they destroyed Corinth in a big battle in 144 BCE. Pompey was the Roman general who took over Jerusalem in 63 BCE. So the Romans were in charge of Judea from 63 BCE on. And this is very important because the Romans, as their power grew in the East, they simply moved increasingly into the Eastern Mediterranean, and they adopted the whole Greek system, the Greek world, and they didn't even try to make it non-Greek. So Romans didn't go around trying to get people in the East to speak Latin. They might put up as an official inscription in an Eastern city in Latin, but then almost always, if it was an official inscription, it would also be listed in Greek. So Romans who ruled in the East were expected to speak Greek, and by this time, all educated Roman men were expected to be able to speak Greek well, if possible. So the Romans didn't try to make the East Roman in that sense culturally, nor did they try to change the language. Greek language, culture, and religions, different religions, and the syncretism, Greek education, the polis structure, all of these things remained in the East throughout the Roman rule of the East, all the way up until the time you had a Christian emperor with Constantine and later. But there's one thing that the Romans made even more of than the Greeks had made of, and this is the patron-client structure. This is a bit more of a distinctly Roman institution, even a legal institution, but it's important for understanding both the Roman Empire as well as early Christianity and its patron-client relations. The household structure of a Roman household was this. And I say household because our word family, which we usually take to mean the biological family, the father, the mother, the children, maybe the grandchildren, maybe the extended family, but we usually mean by it the immediate, the nuclear family with some extension. That use of the English word family, although it comes from the Latin familia, means something totally different in Latin. The Latin word familia didn't mean that biological kin group. It actually was originally used for the slaves of a household. The slaves and the freed persons of a Roman household were legally the ones who were the familia. But so when I say family, we try to avoid even talking about the Roman family because it means something so different to them than what it means to us. So I'll tend to talk about the Roman household because that's what's more meaningful sociologically when we talk about this. The Roman household was constructed like a pyramid. Imagine this is a pyramid, not a triangle. At the top of it is the head of the household, the man. The pater familias. Now, increasingly, you'll actually see this written in the New York Times or used in politics, but it comes from the Latin, and it referred to the head of the household. Pater, father, familias is the household, the family. The pater familias is the oldest man of the household. Under him is his sons, his daughters, and then at the bottom are his slaves, and here are his freedmen, freed persons. And then also you consider, in some ways, free people who may exist as clients. But legally, the word client in Latin refers to the freed slaves of a paterfamilias. Now, where's the wife in this picture? Notice, I didn't put the wife and the mother in there. Why is that? Because legally, she's actually not part of this man's household. She remains part of the household of her father. And she's legally under the control of her father probably, or her brothers if her father is dead, or her grandfather if her grandfather is still alive. But since life expectancy in the ancient world was much less than ours, you didn't have usually several generations in these households because older people just died. The wife, though, is legally a part of her own household over here. Why did the Romans do that? That's very different from the Greeks, very different from other people in the ancient Mediterranean. Why did they want to make sure that the daughters stayed in the households of their fathers? They did this because they didn't want the upper class in Rome, who were the elite, they didn't want any one household or any small group of households to become too powerful. And if you have women marrying off into other families and then they leave the household of their fathers and they are officially and legally a household of somebody else, that may end up increasing those households that have intermarriage coming in and not so much intermarriage going out. By keeping women under the household of the men of their original family, the upper class Romans tried to balance these different households in size and importance. They didn't care about the lower class, really. The lower class didn't really count much. What they cared about, because the Roman Republic by this time was basically a bunch of very important households, wealthy men and their households. And they were the members of the Senate. They were the knight class. They were the people who ran Rome. So they didn't want one king to arise, and they didn't want a small coterie of leaders to arise. They wanted there to be some kind of balance of power among the several major households of Rome, the families of Rome. Now, slaves obviously are under the paterfamilias. When a slave is freed, and in the ancient world, in Roman Empire, most slaves were eventually freed unless they just died before long. They became a freed man. They didn't become a free man, they became a freed man. And that was legally different. So the status of slave was lowest, freed persons was next and highest in Roman law, and free people were next. But even though they became freed, they were still considered a member of this guy's household as his client and his freedman. And they owed certain duties to him. For example, they might, paterfamilia would often put a slave up in business, give a slave enough money to run a business. And that the slave could keep a lot of the income from that business for himself, and the slave could actually gather together a bit of money for himself. He couldn't legally own the money. His master legally owned everything the slave owned. But practically, and in some legal context, what they would do is they'd allow the slave the use of that money, and that's called the peculium. Now, when the slave is freed by the owner, the slave could take the peculium with him, and then he could set up his own business, but he'd still be a client of the owner because he's still officially part of his household. So this maintained even when, and why would a person free a slave? Well, if you have a slave, that slave can't actually sign contracts. The slave might be your business manager, but all the slave could do is the paperwork. But if you need a slave representing your business and you live in Rome and you need somebody in Ostia, the port city of Rome, to be able to be there and watch your imports and your exports of your business, you need someone who can sign contracts, who can lend money, who can borrow money, who can do things like that. Slaves can't do that legally, but freed men can. So rich Romans were often freeing slaves for their own purposes. It was not like they were giving them a great deal. This was part of their constructing their own business expansion. Sons and daughters, though, were still part of the household as long as the paterfamilias was alive. So sons legally were still under their paterfamilias. Now, this is all legally and officially what's the case. You wouldn't really see this working all like this. For example, I said wives were not really part of their husband's household. Legally, that's correct. But you see cases in letters and all kinds of stuff from the ancient world that women actually were more unofficially part of their husband's household. They ran it when he was away, for example. They told his slave, she might have her own slaves and her own property. The wife had her own property that was separate from the husband's property. But in practical purposes, most of the time, they just mixed these together and they might use different things. So the legal situation was set up to try to keep the wife's ownership as part of a different family, and so her money didn't go to her husband, and his money didn't go to her. But this was a legal situation to try to keep this balance of power among households. Practically, sons didn't all live in the same place with their father. They would get married and move off to an apartment or someplace down the street or to another city. But this is the legal situation. Now, when you go to jail, when you go to court, slaves, of course, can't represent themselves in court at all. They don't have any legal standing. But if you're a freed man, the other thing I should tell you is that in Roman law, if you're manumitted as a slave, you're made free. If you're manumitted in the normal way they did it, that makes you a Roman citizen if your owner was a Roman citizen. Notice what this means. Only in the Roman Empire could slavery actually start being a way that you could move up in society. Because if you were a talented slave, your owner might free you, probably would free you. When he freed you, if he was a Roman citizen, you would automatically become a Roman citizen also. And your children would be Roman citizens. And although you were a freed man, which was lower in status than a free person, there was some privileges you couldn't have, your children would be, if they were born after you had been freed, would be free people, not freed. So within a couple of generations, people could move up from being the lowest slaves to 2 generations being free Roman citizens. So Roman slavery and the freedom of that was actually one way in that a few people in the ancient world recognized some kind of social mobility, which was very rare in the Roman Empire. Any questions about any of that?